Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president of the United States Institute of Peace, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody here this morning. For those who don't know, U.S. Institute of Peace was founded a little over 30 years ago, dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, peace is practical, and that it is essential for our national and international security. And we are increasingly, I think, collectively having the conversation that peace is essential for development and peace is essential for addressing the extraordinary burdens that we're seeing today on the humanitarian system. We have seen an increasing upward spiral of crisis. During my 4.5 years prior to being here, when I was at USAID, we saw that the tempo of crisis and the duration of crisis was continually expanding. And in 2015, Ban Ki-moon noted that there was, in the 70-year history of the UN, it was unprecedented to be responding to 10 serious crises at the same time. I am most struck by the fact that a decade ago, 80% of our humanitarian assistance went to natural disasters and 20% went to victims of violent conflict. So a decade later, at a time when we're having increased natural disasters because of global climate change, with ever larger, more vulnerable urban populations, that ratio has flipped. And we now see 80% of our humanitarian assistance going to victims of violent conflict and only 20% going to natural disasters at a time where we have increased strains and burdens on both. And this fact alone, I think, illuminates why we're seeing chronic, persistent underfunding of global appeals that are going ever upwards, so that we had more than 20 billion requested last year for the UN Global Appeal. 60 million people displaced. This room knows all these facts well. We have violence from violent extremism. We have increased fragility. We're looking at medieval siege tactics in Syria and in Iraq that are creating terrible levels of hunger, of suffering. Afghanistan has a new wave of violence, and we're still seeing the results of the civil war in South Sudan. So I don't think it's hyperbole that we're calling this morning's event a world on fire. And the solutions to this will require a joint action that go far beyond the realm of humanitarianism. In the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, USIP has been very happy to partner with Interaction, with the UN Foundation, with World Food Program USA, and the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS. We convened a series of roundtables, 5 to date, to coalesce around these core issues and to look at what are the core recommendations that we as a community collectively have for the World Humanitarian Summit. Last week I attended the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and I know I can see a number of you did as well. And I have to say that against the backdrop of terrible humanitarian crisis, and in a region that is particularly affected by crisis, and despite the summit skepticism that had mounted in advance of the summit, I'm coming away actually quite hopeful. And I'm coming away hopeful for 3 key reasons. First is the summit really modeled a new type of global gathering. It wasn't the usual gov-to-gov ministerial, but it was a very inclusive gathering with more than 9,000 participants that included 173 member states, 55 heads of states, and civil society activists, international NGOs, local NGOs from conflict-affected countries, private sector, 200 youth leaders, which was particularly inspiring, an emphasis on the rights of the disabled, the role of women. It really modeled a different kind of global action that is required to address the kind of problems that we're facing. And it acknowledges that humanitarian action peace building is no longer just the domain of governments and diplomats. It also places a responsibility on everyone to address the issues that we're facing. Secondly, for really the first time, it pulled together government leaders and the humanitarian community that collectively put politics and poor governance at the heart of the crises that we are facing. And for the humanitarian community, which has shied away from considerations of politics, for good reasons, because of the need for independent and impartial action, it nonetheless squarely acknowledged that these are not ultimately humanitarian problems to fix, but it requires that joint understanding, and it requires the spotlight to be shown on the important role of governments to take action and to muster the political will. Finally, and importantly, the World Humanitarian Summit really coalesced a number of critical changes, reforms, and recommendations that the humanitarian and the development community have been discussing for a number of years, and it turned them into acknowledged and in many cases measurable commitments to do things differently. Everything from around how we finance, how we report, how we build bridges and work collectively with the development world so that instead of individual projects, we have a shared focus on the outcomes that we need for greater resilience, for being able to get ahead of conflict. I am enormously encouraged by all of this. It highlighted the innovation of this community. It highlighted the energy and the activism, the determination to do things better and more effectively. This community is really at the forefront of turning all of that discussion and energy and commitment into action that makes a difference on the ground. So I'm very grateful today to co-host today's event with my very good friend Ray Offenheiser, with whom we've shared this conversation for, I think, going on 20 years. And Ray has led an effort at Oxfam America to really lead a charge on a number of hard-hitting recommendations. We're also fortunate to have two panels with us today of top experts and thinkers in these communities to reflect on summit outcomes and how we can really, truly move forward with reforming the humanitarian system. How do we improve our response? And our goal today is to both hear from them and also to engage all of you in a conversation that helps us move forward with the promise of the summit, move toward the events that we're teeing up for this fall around the UN General Assembly. And I know that we'll have a great conversation. For those of you who tweet, we're using the hashtag ReshapeAid. And I'm delighted now to introduce the moderator of our first panel, who will introduce the members of that panel. We're quite fortunate to have Kim Gaddis with us, who's a longtime observer and reporter of foreign policy events, born and raised in Beirut. She's a reporter at BBC News and is an acute observer of the events that have been at the back of causing the humanitarian crisis we have today. Please join me in welcoming Kim to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. If I could ask my panelists to join me on stage as well. While they take their seats, I'll be moderating the panel called Reforming the Humanitarian System. Ray, if you would mind sitting here. Mr. Stahl at the very end, and Anwar, you'll take the seat in the middle. Reforming the humanitarian system and changing people's lives. I'm really delighted to be here to moderate this very important conversation after the World Humanitarian Summit in Turkey. I'm thankful for the invitation. Thank you for thinking of me and including me in this. I'm heartened by your optimism, Nancy, because when we look around us, it does really feel like the world is on fire. There seems to be a time, long forgotten now, perhaps it never existed, where the crises were perhaps, came in neat succession. At least that's how we seem to remember it. And now they all seem to come at once, they overlap, and it has become very difficult for the international community to deal with it. Today, the world spends around $25 billion to help 125 million people devastated by wars and natural disasters. That is 12 times more than 10 years ago, and yet because protracted conflicts are the new normal, because of increased natural disasters, that still means a $15 billion gap in funding, according to a high-level panel report to the UN Secretary General on humanitarian financing. But the problem, as we'll discuss as well in this panel, is not just about financing, it's also about logistics of outdated structures, questions about how much we need to recalibrate the balance of power between international actors and local actors, and of course, how do you continue appealing for aid when people feel there's no end to how much they're being asked to give? And the following panel will address some of that as well, and the more acute crisis as well of refugees. But we have a fantastic panel assembled this morning to dive into these issues. Right next to me is Ray Offenheiser, president of Oxfam America. He's been its president since 1966, and under his leadership, what did I say? 66. No, it definitely says 96. and looking young, you must tell us your secret.
The genes are terrific.
Oxfam America has grown more than sevenfold and repositioned itself in the US as an influential voice on international development and foreign policy. Before Oxfam, he represented Ford Foundation in Bangladesh and in the Andean and Southern Cone regions of South America. In 2012, he was appointed by the Obama administration to represent civil society interests on the Leadership Council of the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa. He has many accomplishments. These panelists are very accomplished. I will keep it a little bit brief. You have their full bios. But Mr. Offenheiser has also served on numerous boards, including the World Economic Forum, the Clinton Global Initiative. And key, I found, is he's a co-founder and board member of the One Campaign and the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. So he certainly knows what he's speaking about this morning. Next to him, we have Mr. Anwar Khan. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Islamic Relief USA. I'll try to get my dates right with this one. He has more than 20 years of experience in the field of humanitarian and development assistance. Born in Pakistan, grew up in England, started working with Islamic Relief Worldwide in '93, and since '94 in the US, he's helped with the expansion of Islamic Relief USA. He has extensive experience in the field, from Chechnya to Gaza, Darfur, Haiti, Pakistan, and Syria. He is on USAID's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid. He's also on the US State Department's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. And last but not least, Mr. Thomas Stahl. He's the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID. He spent most of his career working overseas in international development with USAID since 1988. I do have a problem with dates. Beginning in Sudan, but from Kenya to Gaza to southern Iraq, Ethiopia, Lebanon, you really have experience in difficult working circumstances, including in conflict zones. Since January 2014, Mrs. Stahl has been the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance. Before joining USAID, Mrs. Stahl worked for World Vision International. He also has experience in the private sector. He worked for Aramco in Saudi Arabia in the late 70s and early 1980s, which is an important perspective as well to see how it works in the private sector. There's a lot to discuss. I want to start by asking each one of our panelists to answer an opening question. I'll go from one to the other. We'll have about 25 minutes of conversation between us, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, because as Nancy mentioned, this is a two-way conversation as well. But Ray, I want to start with you. You were at the summit, or Oxfam was at the summit.
Well represented at the summit, yes.
What was Oxfam looking for going into the World Humanitarian Summit? And do you feel that you are satisfied with the outcome? Was it a game changer? Probably not. But I think we can say it's clear it's no longer business as usual.
No, it's no longer business as usual. And maybe just to echo a couple of Nancy's opening comments, I mean, I think for all of us in the humanitarian community, this was an extraordinary moment to have this event. And we credit the UN and many of the other organizations that pulled this together. I would echo a lot of what Nancy said about what was important about the event, the inclusive nature of it. It was a multi-stakeholder event. So we heard from voices and people that we'd never heard from before, refugees, victims, extraordinarily important in having them define problems. The focus on politics and governance that she mentioned, I think, is also, was an important outcome in a positive sense in the big picture scheme of things. Also, the commitments that were made, 1,500 commitments were made at the event. The Secretary General will be sorting all of that out over the coming months, and we'll have a final report, I think, in September at the General Assembly as to what that all will mean and what it all add up to. And then finally, the whole framing of this around the 5 responsibilities, I think, has given us all a framework within which we can all, I think, see ourselves and our work going forward. And I think it's a work plan for, I think, the entire community to focus on. I think in terms of what we were looking for and where I suppose you could say we were disappointed was in the whole, what was done around discussion around international humanitarian law. For Oxfam and for I think many other organizations, given the nature of the crises we see in the world, in Yemen and South Sudan and Syria, we need to revisit and recommit to principles of international humanitarian law in a very serious way, and this has to come from governments. And the problem was we didn't have many of the important heads of state at the meeting, so in some sense the standing of the meeting I think was undermined by their absence, and so in some sense the outcome that we would have hoped for in international humanitarian law was not realized, and I think there's a lot more work for us to do there, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing, maybe in the positive area, I think for Oxfam, was the whole area of local capacity and local empowerment. This is an area that has been core to what Oxfam represents and many other organizations in the humanitarian community, literally since the First World War and through the aftermath of the Second World War. And a lot of what we represent there, I think, is the idea that we've got to be caring for people that are victims of conflict and victims of tragedies like Syria in a serious way. But more importantly, I think we've got to rethink the model in a way that actually empowers local actors who are first responders in many of these cases. And I think the good news coming out of the summit was that the Grand Bargain endorses this concept, I think, rather dramatically and in a very straightforward way with a lot of very clear principles that I think we can all subscribe to, and many of our organizations have done that. I think also there was this commitment to 25% of funding going to local actors, which was a major transition, I think, for the community. A commitment to increasing cash programming for humanitarian programs as well. And then the emergence, interesting, of this new network called NEAR, which is actually a group composed of Southern partner organizations that actually were given voice and had the support of USAID, Oxfam, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're going to be bringing this conversation about local empowerment and local voices into our humanitarian community and debates in the future, and we'll probably hear from them again in the fall at the UN General Assembly. But I think we've not had, a structured and formal organization that's actually been taking that local leadership conversation forward from the grassroots up. It's been coming more from the international NGOs rather than from the people who really should be leading that initiative. So this was good news, I think, on multiple fronts on the local initiatives and local empowerment agenda.
Great. This is a great way to give us some excellent food for thought throughout the conversation on international humanitarian law. MSF, of course, withdrew from the summit, particularly because of their concerns about protection of civilians. It's fantastic that there were new voices and that local actors are being brought in in a more systemic way. Mr. Khan, I want to turn to you as an organization that has a role locally as well. You are in the US, but you work around the world. When you look at the system as it is right now, you look at those big UN structures, you look at how you operate, what do you think is missing in this conversation or in the system when you're operating on the ground?
As you mentioned, I was born in Pakistan. I grew up in England, and I live in America.
So you've got a good comprehensive view.
So I like to think I'm a bridge, but I feel like I'm not from anywhere, but I'm from everywhere. Mm-hmm.
And you have worked everywhere.
Yeah, so I get a lot of frustration from different areas. We believe, so there's a part of me that's from the South. So I want to pretend I'm from the South right now. So I want to go to that one third of me. So there's a feeling that the UN organizations are designed as a big bureaucracy. They're giving money to big aid agencies. They're not reaching out to the locals. And there's a lot of talk about that, but we haven't seen that over the past few decades. And I believe it was mentioned that 0.2%. We want to go from 0.2% to 25%. That's a huge increase. They're not ready to take it.
Why?
So they don't have the capacity, so we have to invest in the capacity. Now, some organizations, Oxfam and others, Islamic Relief and others, we've been trying to do this for the past decade or decades, trying to do this, but this is something that we need to be ready. So we need to change the dynamic. This can't be like it was after World War II. There was a feeling after World War II that we needed humanitarian principles, humanitarian law, and most of the people discussing it were white. The people in the South, majority of them were under colonial rule. This was their opportunity 70 years later to come and discuss humanitarian principles at this convention. So I think it was important, and it's been 2 years of consultation. So one thing that we really liked about this conference, and I was there in Istanbul, is that we were invited to the table. So many people feel in the past we weren't invited to the table, and we were. I feel very positive, very positive. I know our colleagues in Doctors Without Borders weren't there, but traditionally they are invited to these meetings. Many players from the South are not invited to these meetings. So for them it was an opportunity to have their voice heard. For us here in America, we really have to question ourselves. What is our purpose? Are we here to receive funding, take our cut, then send it to our partners overseas? Or are we here to do something more than that? Really, is it only that are we the best people to really decide what the local decisions are on the ground? Now I'm going to put my faith-based hat on. It was wonderful that faith-based organizations were involved. There was one main session to do with faith. There was some side panel discussions. In the past, many of us felt that we weren't being taken seriously and we were deliberately being sidelined. So it was nice that we were included. I see Jean up there from Joint Learning Initiatives, and we people keep on asking, yes, but this stuff you're doing, do you have any evidence for it? So at this conference, Joint Learning Initiative produced documents, evidence-based, of how each of the core functions that we were talking about at WHS, how faith-based organizations are involved. I myself am a result of one of those faith-based organizations projects. I was born in a Christian hospital in Pakistan, Holy Mission Hospital in Sialkot, Pakistan. I'm fully aware about the amazing network of hospitals, faith-based, that we have in America and around the world of different faiths. So I think it's important for us to not just talk with people, but where are we going moving forward? As we're being more inclusive, many people in the North may not be that religious, but many people in the South are. So I want to come back to what I said earlier about a bridge. We need to recognize our differences, but work together on what we have in common. And that's why I'm excited. I'm very aware of all of the conflicts, more and more conflicts, and many of these, now I'm going to put my Muslim hat on, so I covered a few hats. So now my Muslim hat, many of these countries have Muslim majorities. The Muslim world is in pain, and the victims of the atrocities are seen as the perpetrators. The way that we are in this country demonizing Syrians in the last few months and the last year, it took us decades to do that with the Palestinians. We know the Palestinians aren't treated like most other human beings. We know that here in America. But the way that it's changed with the Syrians, so this is an opportunity for us to hopefully make some changes.
There's a whole political debate, of course, taking place on the sidelines. And what you may have noticed is going on in this country, a general election that we're heading towards that is going to be very interesting, with a lot of these issues being raised there. And I will come back to you, Mr. Khan, about the issue of being an Islamic charity and the problems that you face. But I think that part of the problem with the war in Syria is also that people feel there isn't really anything they can do to help. I've heard that certainly from many of my cousins in the Netherlands. I'm half Dutch, and they say, yeah, we read the headlines, but what can we do beyond donating $5 here and there? We feel helpless, and I think that has been also one of the issues with raising funds for Syria, is that people see no end to it, as opposed to a natural disaster where people feel, okay, you can donate this much, and in 6 months villages will be rebuilt and we can move on. But Mr. Stahl, I want to turn to you, just staying focused on the start of this conversation with the World Humanitarian Summit. What role can the US, should the US play to lead the international community towards making sure that these commitments made at the summit, towards making sure that these efforts to reform the system really happen? Or is the US today in a position, as some may believe, where it should learn to share the system better instead of leading it?
Thank you. Certainly the US is the largest humanitarian donor, and we take that responsibility very seriously, that not only that we provide a lot of funds, but that we do try to lead on a number of these issues, and the ones that were highlighted at the conference. Certainly of trying to make not only more aid, but better aid. Even the hashtag, what's it, reform aid?
Reshape aid.
Reshape aid, because we think that's critically important, and that we can take a leadership role as the largest donor. And so we're doing a number of things on that, both in terms of the use of our funds, but also the way that the coordination is implemented. So part of that is, as Roy was talking about, and Anwar, about providing more assistance to local organizations, but also that even within the system that we do it in a more coordinated fashion. We think that that's a big part of it, that you need to have a coordinated needs assessment and a coordinated implementation of that. So that means both in terms of the donors better coordinating. So we're going to change and try to work more toward things like a common reporting platform for donors rather than each one having to respond on their own. We're looking at a better integration between humanitarian and development programs, which we think is critical, that we make better use of the resources we have and try to get at the root causes. And so that often means that you've got to go after some development issues. And I think we made some major progress on that at the summit, a lot of discussion about that. And so, in a number of ways, I think we can take leadership role in providing a voice for those kind of issues. On the humanitarian law issue that and norms that was raised, we do think more needs to be done, and maybe even could have been done. It was difficult in this conference because of the nature of the conference. One of the strengths was the multi-sectoral, groups of actors there, but maybe the weakness is then when you don't have an intergovernmental, you can't really bring strong commitments.
You need teeth, basically.
With teeth, yes. Yeah. So we did put out a statement on international humanitarian law and norms, and we got 47 other countries to sign up to it, but that's something we need to take the lead on moving forward. And I think with our summit coming up at the UN General Assembly is one way to push forward some of those issues.
I want to follow up with a question on the system and then dive deeper into some of the other issues. And the question is for all of you. Feel free to chime in. How do we turn this massive system of diverse actors, of local organizations, international organizations, UN organizations, a system that is quite entrenched with some people who feel quite comfortable in their jobs, with huge overheads, with the idea that the West comes with the aid and the rest receives, and countries like Russia and China that are perhaps only now coming to the realization that perhaps they too have a responsibility. I'm not going to get into the role that Russia is playing today in Syria, but just hearing about an event yesterday here at USIP about China coming to the realization that perhaps it should be concerned about the responsibility to protect. Is the system too entrenched? I mean, what is it going to require to make it more nimble and effective?
Well, maybe I'll jump in on that one. I think apart from the particular issues I mentioned maybe in the opening comment, I think one of the big issues for Oxfam going into the summit was a belief that the humanitarian system, if we refer to it that way, which has been led by the United Nations since really the ends of the Second World War and the construction of the United Nations agencies, is perhaps not fit for purpose for the 21st century, and that it needs a radical overhaul. And it needs a radical overhaul for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is, as Nancy said, we are facing 10 humanitarian crises, historic. We've seen the largest, mass migration since the Second World War, and it may only be the tip of the iceberg. We're facing a climate challenge that actually is not something that's coming down the road. It's real, it's happening, it's driving migration today. We're seeing, in some sense, collapsing of agricultural systems in some countries, which is actually forcing people to leave because actually rainfall is irregular, drought is more frequent, and people are not finding that they can make a livelihood, so they have to look for a livelihood elsewhere. So we may see in the next 2 decades migration on a scale we can't even imagine. In the face of that, can a large bureaucracy with a headquarters in New York and Geneva manage that? Or do we have to rethink the model entirely? And that's why this whole issue of participation of local partners is critical. And thinking about the role of governments and how well equipped they are to deal with this as leaders, exercising leadership at the national level. We can no longer accept the notion that the future is about the big humanitarian machine arriving 2 weeks after the disaster and saving everybody's life and bypassing the local actors, if not crushing them entirely in the process, which to some degree has happened in a number of these cases in the past. So we've got to think about a system where there are going to be cases where we're going to need an international response and large-scale operational capability. Let's not deny that, but let's figure out when and where and how we need that. Let's figure out how we de-stress the system such that we build local capacity. I mean, one of the interesting things when you look at this issue of local capacity, you find that the investment in local capacity, as Anwar said, now in local capacity building and preparedness, if you look at what's going into the UN system, is minuscule, 1.84%. If you look at cash programming, it's only something less than 5%. Even Ban Ki-moon only called for let's get to 1% in terms of these investment levels in the future for some aspects of local capacity building. We've got to be much more ambitious in what donor money's out there going to local capacity building. We've also got to actually enlist governments to think more creatively where they can produce domestic resource mobilization, in other words, produce their own resources and invest in preparedness and resilience at the country level in collaboration with some of these international initiatives. So there's a lot of creativity that's got to go into rethinking the model. I think it also, maybe just one final point, I think we're at an inflection point in the international development and aid community in a number of different respects. Aid money is probably flatlining relative to foreign aid investment and local domestic tax acquisition. And so in other words, where the funds come from that do this may not just be from ODA, they may have to come from local sources. The other important point Tom made is we've got to break down this division between humanitarian work and development work. We've got to see sort of a continuity here between an emergency, which is not an aberration, but particularly with climate change, slow onset emergencies are a development challenge. And we've got to break down those silos and see a more natural relationship and flexible use of funding as something that we can do within a system that's actually dramatically reformed.
But aren't some organizations opposed to the blurring of those lines? That's MSF's concern.
Well, on the MSF issue, I would say the following. First of all, MSF, like many of our organizations, was founded with a passionate concern for what I guess we would refer to as the humanitarian imperative, which is we want to save lives. That's why we were created. I mean, in our case, during the Second World War, we were founded as an effort to get food into Greece in 1942 after the German withdrawal, when there was famine across Greece. And we continue to be passionately, as well as every humanitarian in this room, committed to saving lives. That being said, climate change poses a different kind of challenge that has a humanitarian dimension to it, but also has a development dimension to it. So the old categories and the old approaches maybe don't serve today. So while I can respect MSF's desire to actually, deliver impartial, neutral assistance to victims of conflict wherever they may be, on the one hand, I also think we need to be thinking creatively about new humanitarian challenges in the 21st century that are not the classic ones and that require a whole different approach.
Anwar, how do local organizations, smaller organizations, I mean, you're not very small, but you're not the UN. How do you cope with these changes? How do you fit in? How much can you adapt? And what can you propose in terms of new ways of working?
We either adapt or die. At our size, we're not big enough. We're not too big to fail. We're small enough to fail. We adapt or die. Mm-hmm. It's very simple. And I can talk from my own experience here. With the situation here in America, there are only 2 offices of Islamic relief I've seen around the world that for security reasons do not put their name on their buildings. One is in Syria, and one is in Alexandria, just outside of DC. These are the only 2 Islamic relief offices around the world for security reasons that don't put their name on there. We have to adapt. We have to work with some people who may not want to work with us. So to us, it really is you have to adapt. And I just want to go off what was mentioned earlier. I am very optimistic. I have to be. What's the other option? I have to be optimistic. I have seen changes. I know that I wouldn't be invited in gatherings like this a few years ago as somebody who was from forget Muslim organization, that wasn't going to happen, but for even a faith-based organization. So I see more inclusive of now than I saw before. When we were talking about cash programs, people were telling us we were crazy 20 years ago. Now they say it's fashionable, but some of us were talking about it years ago and we were told to be quiet. No, you guys and your zakah and yes, but we were explaining from a theological point of view. We thought it was very important to empower these widows by giving them money. And we were told, no, you're just being lazy, you don't know how to do the work properly. That's not the way the big boys do the work. So there's a lot of changes, and I'm very, as I said, optimistic about those changes. The shift that's being done, we saw at WHS. Someone said to me, what difference do you think was going to happen in this meeting? I said, in this meeting, no, this is a big party to celebrate everything we've done in the previous 2 years. And the effect of this function is what it's going to have moving forward. So I believe that the talk about cash programs, the talk about innovative new ways of money coming in, the talk.
For example, how do you bring new money in? How do you appeal to donors to keep giving?
We haven't had a problem with that.
No.
No, we haven't had a problem with that. You just do a better job. You work harder. Well, in our case, you work harder, and for you pray harder. You think of innovative ways. We went from $0 to $60 million cash from entirely private sources. So we knew that we weren't very popular if we were going to try to get institutional funding with our name. So it forced us to be really innovative. Mm-hmm. So we may do puppet shows to raise money. We may do fashion shows to raise money. We may sit down and do religious conferences to raise money. Right now, one of our largest sources of funding for Yemen is from Catholic Relief Services. So the Catholics are giving us more money than any Muslim organization in America for Yemen. And we're giving them money for other projects. We're working with World Vision. We're working with Adventists. Right now, the work projects in Ecuador are being done through Catholic Relief Services. So I would say that when you have, when you're under pressure, that's an opportunity for you to either, as I said, die or become stronger.
And a recognition of our shared humanity, of course, this inclusive conversation which happened in Turkey. Mr. Stahl, do you think that the system needs to be completely ripped apart and put back together, or is there some way that it can be reformed enough that it can address those 21st century challenges of protracted conflicts and climate change and crises on a level that we haven't seen before?
Yeah, probably ripped apart is a little too much, but certainly some improvements need to be made. And I think some steps were made in that direction at this conference, but more needs to be done. Among other things, the existing system needs to be made more flexible, more coordinated, breaking down stovepipes not only between humanitarian and development, but within the humanitarian.
And as you mentioned, common reporting platforms, more coordination.
Exactly,
to know where everything's
coordination,
going.
both in the implementation side and even in the donor side. And but also we need to focus on root causes.
Yeah.
Okay, much more, and building local capacity. So all that needs to be a part of the system now. And then the financing part that we were just talking about becomes very critical too. And again, being more inclusive, looking for non-traditional donors, and the private sector. I think that's another part that we haven't sort of tapped into yet. And not only, I mean, certainly there's a certain aspect of corporate social responsibility that you can tap into, but also private sector can bring a lot of innovation, a lot of energy, a lot of new ideas that is in their business interest, shall we say.
Because it is often about interests, right?
It is,
I mean, of course, we want to appeal to people's humanitarian concerns, but if you put it in terms of interest, saying, this is going to be bad for your business, you need to be more corporate, socially responsible.
That's right.
That rings a bell.
And again, that often then goes back to less about the humanitarian response and more about preparation, early warning, building local capacity, doing those things ahead of time so that you reduce the need for the response at the end. And that's saving lives as well. I think sometimes we unfortunately get into this, well, humanitarian assistance is only saving lives and development is not saving lives. But of course, building capacity and building systems in place to respond to disasters before they get out of hand is also saving lives.
I want to talk a little bit more about local actors. There are advantages to empowering local actors. There are also concerns in countries like Syria, in countries like Sudan, where local actors may be under pressure from the government. They may not have the independence to give aid where is needed. We're acutely seeing that unfold in Syria. Can you tell us a little bit about each one of you, what you think of that point? Ray, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think this whole shift to more emphasis on local empowerment and local capacity building is first of all, it's a big mindset shift for the community, particularly for the big bureaucracies that have not given this that much attention. And I do think we need to recognize that and actually have this discussion about the fact that this is a necessary change, but it's not necessarily an easy change. Second thing is I think we have to recognize that there are institutional actors out there who are ready to collaborate, not only not-for-profit organizations at the national level who as partners, but also governments. So Oxfam, for example, has a program in Central America, dealing with natural disasters in an area where these are very frequent, where we have 4 governments involved in a collaboration, mayors involved, and not-for-profit sector all meeting collaboratively to talk about preparedness and disaster risk reduction in that region and how to invest wisely in doing the work well. I think critical to actually minimizing, I suppose you might say, some of the risks, if you will, that have to do with corruption, if I can put that word on the table.
Or political
manipulation. Well, I think on the issue of sort of risk of loss of funds, which governments worry about and Congress worries about, I think we have to be very clear-eyed about doing good risk assessment up front about what partners we're working with. And I think a lot of our organizations have gotten pretty good at that. We know which organizations are solid, have a track record, have good boards, good governance, and are well managed and are going to manage our resources well. Oxfam itself supports 4,000 not-for-profit organizations around the world, and we've been funding many of those organizations for literally decades. So we have a sense of who the fair-minded actors are. On the larger issue of potential for manipulation, co-optation, or political pressure, I think there's a larger discussion that's going on right now about the role of civil society organizations and the space needed for them to do their work properly. And this was in discussion at the summit as part of a larger discussion that's going on around the role of civil society around the world, and the fact that we're in this paradoxical moment where civil society is playing an ever more important role, gaining more voice and presence at important meetings, and yet at the national level, the civil society space is closing. It's closing not only for advocacy, which is where it started, but actually even maybe around issues of access and service delivery, where the definitions of what the role of these civil society actors can be is being prescribed by governments through legislation that deals with their organizational mandates, as well as with their ability to use the internet and a variety of other constraints that are actually undermining the ability of these citizen organizations to really contribute.
Tom and Anwar, can you chime in on the advantages and disadvantages of working with local actors?
Certainly, I mean, we've already identified building local capacity as an issue, and that's something that we need to focus on because a lot of these local organizations don't have capacity. And sometimes I think we need to be a little more open to the idea of working through larger organizations who then will support local organizations. But they can be structured in such a way that their job really is to build capacity and support local organizations. Secondly, something we haven't talked about maybe, and that is that the vast majority and increasingly over time of these disasters, whether they're natural or conflict related, happen in fragile states. And there's an initiative called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States that is an interesting model that I think we need to put more effort into. And that one is you have a group of self-identified fragile states who agree with the international community to a set of standards that they will try to meet, okay, in terms of the way they operate, even things like the role of civil society in their community, and a number of rule of law issues and so on, financial and so on. And then the international community can work with them to build that capacity, to build those systems within there. Somalia is probably our best example of a country that's moved quite well in that direction. Other countries not so much, but that's a model for building local capacity in national governments, and in such a way that they actually engage with the local civil society. And I might say, what's sort of interesting, maybe paradoxically, with what Roy was talking about, the closing spaces, is that it may be partly as a reaction to the rise of civil society and the empowerment of civil society. 20, 30 years ago, they wouldn't need to put in these restrictive laws because there was no civil society, or it was very cowed. Now they're standing up, speaking out, and we need to find ways to support them. But hopefully it's a trend that over time is moving in the right direction.
That's fascinating about the New Deal, and obviously prevention is the best remedy, and if there was a way to solve the war in Syria, there'd be so much less concern about the long-term needs of humanitarian assistance there. Anwar, you want to say something, and then we're going to go to Ray and start going to questions.
Yes, governments may decide who gets food and who starves to death. Yeah. We have seen that in Syria. This is really one of the worst examples we've seen of this. We're talking medieval sieges are being done. They're starving populations out. We're going back. So in many things we are going forward, but sometimes we're going back. So in the case of Syria, we've seen that. Humanitarian principle, humanitarian law, no one's holding them accountable in Syria, the Syrian government, for what's going on over there. But at the same time, I would still say that we still need to do the capacity building. We need to definitely be worried about corruption. But we shouldn't assume just because people are of color and poor that they're corrupt. Many countries have different ways of being corrupt. As far as for us over here, we need to improve the capacity. The examples I would give with Yemen and Somalia. Islamically, through a partner organization, Humanitarian Forum, we set up local organizations that would help to improve the capacity inside Mogadishu and inside Yemen. And one of the ladies, the lady who's the head of Humanitarian Forum in Yemen, spoke at the WHF, and she said, I cannot afford to go by humanitarian principles. I don't have the luxury to do that. I have to take money from one of the belligerents. On one side they're bombing them, on the other side they're the only people giving them food, or their people will die. So you can talk nicely about not taking sides in a conflict, but when that's the only source of food we get, we don't have the luxury. You have the luxury of having donors that hold you accountable, and you can decide to turn some donations down. We don't have those luxuries.
And the lines really do blur in a conflict, but talking about Syrian local actors, you know, organizations like the White Helmets are doing heroic work, and there are so many civil society groups that are doing great work on the ground as well that, you know, are the unsung heroes. Ray, I'll give you the last word before we go to questions.
Well, I just briefly wanted to build on some of Tom's comments, which actually I thought were really interesting in terms of how the aid community is trying to kind of assist civil society and build local capacity. Some of the, and the funding for that, interestingly, is coming out, I think, from both the humanitarian side of USAID as well as from the development side. But I think, but it's illustrative of the fact that, to some degree, now I'm going to say things that Tom can't say, but I can. You know, to some degree, the bureaucracies in the aid business, the donor organizations, to some degree, are limited by what their structures provide in terms of fundings for particular kind of activities. And this is why this whole issue of creating greater flexibility by breaking down this divide between development and humanitarian and seeing this as kind of a part of a continuum of work is very important as kind of a redesign principle. And so that's the first point. The second point is, you know, if we take all overseas development assistance that's funded around the world now, only 0.4% is actually funding disaster risk reduction from the development accounts, which is very little money if Tom and his colleagues want to actually be working with governments on building local capacity. We need to get that number up. The Secretary General called for it to go to 1%. We think it should go to at least 5%. That's another big jump in the way the financing is allocated. But we think if there's greater flexibility in the development funding accounts, those folks on the development side can collaborate more effectively with those folks on the humanitarian side. Also, I just want to underline that there is a piece of legislation called the STRIDE Act, which is actually you know, being discussed in Congress, and there's some sponsors for it. And STRIDE stands for Stemming the Risks and Impacts of Disasters and Emergencies, or this, and then the acronym, of course, STRIDE Act. But the principle here is actually to allow the aid system and USAID particularly to have greater flexibility to do precisely that, to use aid dollars in particular cases to build local capacity and to fund preparedness and disaster risk reduction work in ways that they haven't been able to do before. So a little bit more discretion gets a little bit more creativity and a little bit more innovation in the system, and that's what we need.
Great. We're going to open the floor to questions. There are mics being passed around. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, please introduce yourself, and do keep your questions short so we can get to as many speakers as possible. I see were you raising your hand, sir? No. Up there, please.
Thanks very much. Jean Duff with the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. There was a lot to be excited about at the summit, and I think the mind shift that Ray speaks to is something that we should see as a great opportunity. Picking up on some of Anwar's comments, I think we were very excited to see a tremendous growth in collaboration and confidence and presence among the very diverse religious community, local, global, across faith lines. If the panel would turn their good brains and experience to cracking the code of resistance within the bureaucracy writ large. Our experience was one of great disappointment that in spite of the sessions that Anwar spoke of, including a magnificent session at which the Patriarch of Istanbul spoke, and many of the world's religious leaders spoke about the deep and sustained engagement of religious networks as first responders in humanitarian response. In spite of the evidence that was presented, that Anwar also referred to, that in the end, in the chair's summary, for example, there is not one word of reference to the capacity and the necessity of engaging religious and faith networks as local responders. So we have a long way to go in penetrating the bureaucracy and in moving that mind shift. And I'd like the panel to comment and to give some guidance on how we should now move. Thank you.
Who is ready to crack the code?
Well,
where does this resistance come from, do you think?
well, I think there's probably a variety of different reasons. I mean, there's a lot of historic reasons why across faith-based boundaries, communities have been at odds with one another, and there's residuals of those conflicts. But I think what we have to look for, if we're going to crack the code, if you will, are what the private sector would refer to as first movers. And where do we find those first movers? Well, I think we're fortunate right now to have a pope who actually has been a first mover on a whole variety of issues. And I don't think it would be that difficult a challenge to actually bring forward this issue to him in a way that actually, and he's been working across boundaries, I think religious boundaries, in ways that have been extraordinary, not only within the Christian faith, but also across boundaries with other faiths. And I'm aware of some other things he's been doing on economic development and growth issues and inequality questions, where he's engaging in multi-stakeholder dialogues in the Vatican in ways that we've never seen before with any other pope. And in some cases, jointly with the church, with the Anglican Church in the UK. But what we haven't seen is kind of a large interfaith initiative where we're getting the Pope plus his equivalents across the other faith communities coming together to say they're going to have their humanitarian summit. And what would that look like? And what would they commit to collectively to complement the commitments that were at the summit in Istanbul in a way that actually would demonstrate, in some sense, the commitments and actions they're already taking. The faith community is a bedrock of a lot of what we do as humanitarian organizations. The Quakers, the Catholic Church, CRS, Islamic Relief, they're everywhere in our community. I think it's a question of, do we want to have them give voice to this agenda for reform and play a role in helping us all within the humanitarian community drive it?
Anwar, an interfaith meeting on humanitarian aid?
No, we've been doing this. We've been talking about this. This has been going on. Again, this is something new. It wasn't there before. I would say, there's no equivalent to the Pope, by the way.
Yes,
the Pope is the Pope. There's no equivalent.
As well.
Someone from the Muslim world, we don't believe in that. But we love him, but there's nobody equivalent to that. And we have to recognize that different faiths have different structures. But what I would say is, I know when I was at WHS, Jean was talking about bringing a summit next year on interfaith work. And the Muslim organizations that were doing Humanitarian Forum were talking about doing their summit. And we're saying, how could we link our summit with the work that Jean's doing? How could we link our Muslim summit with the interfaith summit? And we encourage our friends of other faiths to do their summit, but then we come together and we share that information. We were involved with the WHS for about 2 years. We funded in many different countries. You wouldn't expect Islamic Relief to be involved in consultations in Norway, Italy, Germany. You'd expect us to be in Tunisia, Yemen, and others, but we were in other countries. And I know here in America, I believe it was through Interaction, I was involved with WHS consultation here in Washington, D.C. So we are working through faith-based initiatives. We are trying to do that. But we're not getting the recognition. And I would, once Jean, let me know how to crack the code. But what I would say is, before we're knocking on the door, we're allowed at the table, but we're not able to eat. But at least I would say we're allowed at the table and we made our way to the door. So I would say that it goes back to your previous question. When you have bureaucracies that have been built up over decades, either you can do a revolution or evolution, okay? And I don't want to make any comments, but many of our hearts were broken what we saw in the Arab Spring and the revolutions there. So I'm not saying revolution is wrong. I'm just stating that my own personal philosophy is more evolution. And you have to explain to people who hate you, who want to kill you, that you want to help them. I mean, just recently in Louisiana, we're trying to distribute aid. And we got kicked out by the sheriff of one of the counties in Louisiana because we were Muslims, and we're not meant to be giving out cash cards. We're not meant to be helping people who aren't Muslim. And we just recently got kicked out.
What was the aid program?
We have a disaster response team. We're working in partnership with the American Red Cross. They were furious. This is the second time now in America we have been people trying to shut down civil space because we are helping people who aren't Muslim, helping people who don't look like us. And we're trying to do human to human. Even then, we're talking about shutting down civil space in other countries. It's happening here. But what I would say back to the question about the code is, it's going to take a long time.
Tom, is there a resistance to in the West where society is becoming more secular, has been, particularly in Europe, is there a resistance to, faith-based organizations, even though in the US it's been a long tradition with the Quakers, with the missionaries?
Yeah. No, I don't think there's a resistance. Certainly we're working, with Islamic Relief, with many other religious organizations of various, faiths. And there is an issue of building capacity, of the organizations themselves getting sort of more involved and more engaged. And on the ground, we're seeing some real success, in the Central African Republic. Great work between the Muslim and Christian leaders there. In Nigeria, they're doing that. In South Sudan, we're working with the leaders there. Now, they have their own problems of capacity, often even the ethnic or other religious divides within the country are reflected on them as well. And so we have to find ways to work around that. But I think I agree with my colleague that an evolutionary process is the right way to go. But
time is also of the essence.
a conscious effort to move in that direction.
Yeah, all right. There's a question in the front. If you could get the microphone here. Or perhaps from the other side might be easier. 2 microphones coming your way. If you could please introduce yourself as well.
Good morning, Maureen White from the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS, and thank you all for being here today. It's been very interesting. I have one question about the progress at the summit. It was a UN summit, and we talk about reforming bureaucracies. The UN, of course, is the biggest bureaucracy in this process. Almost half, or maybe more than half, of all humanitarian assistance goes to 6 UN agencies. What indications did you see at the summit, or do you foresee in the future, of the UN agencies' willingness to reform themselves to address some of the things that you've talked about today?
Shall I jump in?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, can an institution that needs reform, to be reformed itself, can it lead the path towards reform?
It's a very difficult question, and I think we certainly would like to see more, and that's something that we as the USAID, the US government, and working with other donors and international organizations are pressing on that issue, and specifically on these issues of a more coordinated approach, both in terms of needs assessment, of the strategic plan and the implementation, and that's going to take strong leadership from the UN itself, as you mentioned. I think that does come back to us in the international donor community because we provide the funding for the UN. So we have some leverage, and that's something that we want to continue to work toward. We're not there yet. I do think that the Sherpa process, we haven't talked about that, and the grand bargain, okay, that there's some opportunities in there that we need to take advantage of, and so some real follow-up is going to be needed from this summit, specifically on that issue as well as others. We do have the UN General Assembly summits, both the US one on refugees, but then there's also a broader one that the UN General Assembly President is leading, and that will give us some opportunities. It's going to be a long-term process, and probably we need to have a sort of an iterative approach. Not all or nothing at once, but how do we start to break down some of those silos, some of those resistance? And it's going to be a very critical time because we'll have a new UN Secretary General, we'll have a new WHO director, and several important positions are going to be turning, as well as within many of the donor countries. So I think this is a time to move in that direction.
Ray, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Well, I think a careful reading of the laws of organizational development would suggest that bureaucracies seldom reform themselves. Just saying. And maybe since I've been around since 1966,
Tell me your secret for useful looks.
I just offer a quick historical perspective. Actually, the UN has been challenged before on the efficiency and effectiveness of its work. And one example I just offer is the aftermath of the Rwanda crisis. In the aftermath of the Rwanda crisis, there was a mess on the ground. There was a big mess on the ground. The UN agencies were all fighting to get in there to the camps in the eastern Congo. There was very little coordination on the ground. They were also fighting with one another to get funding, get more and more funding from the donors. There was no coordination of the funding mechanism. The UN leadership in New York was extraordinarily weak, and it was an awful situation. And what happened actually in that particular moment is the international NGO community of that era actually had, for the first time, a meeting with the Security Council members to talk about this disastrous situation in Rwanda, in the Rwandan aftermath. And this is during Kofi Annan's tenure, and he realized that he needed to take a stronger hand. There had to be much better coordination on a whole lot of different fronts of the agencies themselves and how they were led and what their roles were and who came in and who didn't come into particular emergency situations. And out of that, OCHA was born. Now, actually, OCHA was actually a significant improvement in the way this whole system worked. And it's a good example of what you might call incrementalist bureaucratic reform that got us to where we are now. And then in the course of the last 10 years, there's also been the creation of the cluster frameworks that have actually driven a little bit down into the system, coordination among the different sort of sectoral actors in the system. That's also been a good thing. But I think what we're talking about today is maybe something a little bit more radical, which has to do with the system, the UN system, giving up a certain amount of its leadership role, its autonomy, and its funding. That's a tough ask, and that's a big political ask, and that ask has to be pushed for by citizens, pushing their governments to actually change the way they're approaching this issue and the way they're talking to the UN about its role, and the way they're talking to recipient governments about their responsibilities to actually care for their citizens, invest in local capacity building, create stronger ministries for preparedness, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about systemic reform, we've got to talk about it on multiple levels. We've got to talk about multiple levels of financing. We've got to talk about a different mandate and role for the UN. And that's maybe a little bit beyond the sort of the incrementalist, reforms we've seen over the last few years. But I think what we learned from the Rwanda case is it does require some political push and a bit of a jolt to the bureaucratic system.
I'm not shocked, right. We have time for one, possibly two more questions. Right here, the gentleman with the tie, and then why don't we take the second question behind him, the lady with the black top as well, and then we can answer both questions.
Hi, my name is Matt Jelasik. I'm a Franklin Fellow at USAID. My interest is in refugee camps. And so my question to the panel is, with a $2.5 trillion annual budget deficit for the Sustainable Development Goals, how do we start humanitarian responses looking forward to long-term sustainable development?
Would you pass the microphone to the lady behind you? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lucy, and I'm from Yazidi Relief Fund. My question is to USAID. What is your project for Yazidis, and do you have any?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you have any projects for Yazidis? Since 2014, they were facing genocide, and genocide has been recognized in the U.S. Government. So my question is...
Yazidis,
yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, do you want to...
Okay.
And then we'll get the input as well on the question of refugees, which will be addressed as well in the second panel.
Sure. Yeah, they'll definitely get into that. Maybe I'll take the second question first and then get to the first one as well. Certainly, the plight of the Yazidis has been, highly publicized and very important to USAID. My last job before this one is I was the USAID director in Baghdad, in Iraq, and I traveled up there to Erbil and that area many times, and met with Yazidi leaders as well as other leaders in the community. We don't have a special program just for Yazidis. USAID can't work that way. We have to work based on need. Now, of course, the need of the Yazidis is very high, so a large portion of our assistance is going there, both in terms of making sure that the actual humanitarian needs are met, food and shelter and water and so on, but even psychosocial. So we've initiated special psychosocial programs for people who've been badly affected by atrocities, and Yazidis are definitely getting a big part of that assistance. And we continue to follow that. I've met with Yazidi leaders here in America as well to make sure that our assistance is there. On the broader issue of sort of the relief to development, in a way, is what you were after. Again, I think that's so critical. I've mentioned it several times in addressing root causes, building capacity all the way from early warning to preparedness to disaster risk reduction, things like safety nets and so on, and finding ways to build local capacity so that when a shock happens, whether it's a natural disaster or conflict related, you can also have conflict mitigation programs built in. I was just in northern Kenya a couple of weeks ago, and we have a program there in an area that has seen successive problems with drought and conflict among pastoralist groups. Okay, and so in our development programs, we're building in conflict mitigation as well, and sometimes that conflict is between local community and refugees, and you can build in systems to get people to talk together and address those things while they're before they get out of hand. So that's important.
Sorry, $2.5 trillion is the question. Where's the money going to come from to make this happen?
I mean, there are funding gaps everywhere.
There's a funding gap. I mean, again, we have to...
Just a small one.
A small one. I mean, just from USAID, 15 years ago, the OFDA budget was a little over 200 million. This past year, it was 2.4 billion. So our funding has increased, but still not keeping up with the needs. So we need to find more donors, but also better, more effective use of the resources we have. And that means a more integrated, coordinated system, but also, I go back to then addressing root causes before they get out of hand, which I think will reduce the cost. We've seen that in Ethiopia with the recent drought, that a lot of our early warning, mitigation, safety net programs have actually reduced the cost of responding to the humanitarian assistance. And I think that can be true also for the refugee program.
Anwar, you had some great energy and innovative ideas about how to keep people from giving money, so we're counting on you for those, to find those few billion dollars.
Oh, trillion.
Trillion. But Ray, I want to give you the final word, and then we're going to move on to the next panel.
Yeah, well, just to build on Tom's point, there is an argument for more effective use of aid, and there's been a big debate on this that's been going on outside the humanitarian community that has incorporated the humanitarian community to some degree. That's what the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network here in Washington has been working on literally for the past 8 years. And one of the things we need in the United States is a new foreign aid bill that actually is for the 21st century. And we need a political constituency to get behind that. And so hopefully with a new president and a new government, new Congress, maybe we can push that kind of an agenda. We're still living with the 1961 Foreign Aid Act here in the United States. It is out of date. We need something new. Second point, the whole Sustainable Development Goals initiative, it's an extraordinarily ambitious initiative. It's one that gives us a lot of hope, and it gives us something to work on for the next 15 years. We're not going to have the money if we rely on the traditional model. We have to completely rethink the financing for development model. And the meeting in Addis Ababa that occurred before the General Assembly that approved the Sustainable Development Goals had that debate. And what was the conclusion of that debate? The conclusion of that debate was ODA is more or less flatlining, and we're not going to fill that $2.5 trillion gap with foreign aid funding. However, if you actually look at foreign aid as a percent of foreign direct investment and the accumulation of resources at the national level through remittances, equity investments, private sector investments, foreign aid is 8% of foreign direct investment and falling. There's all this money in these new countries. We have all these emergent economies. They now have to assume some responsibility for their own development financing in their own countries. What does that require? That requires effective tax systems. It requires better taxation of corporate presence in their countries, better presence of better tax systems that are actually taxing their citizens, that actually can, where you have an emerging middle class, it can actually participate in financing development in those countries. This model that's been around since the Second World War, this is over. We're at an inflection point. It's a new ball game. We've got to rethink the financing model.
Do you want to say something, Anwar, to wrap us up?
I think it's really important to remember that there is more money outside of the traditional players. I know when I was in Pakistan, I think there was a telethon and they raised $100 million in a few hours. But we don't talk about that in America because we think they're poor people, but they have big hearts. So I think more and more we need local governments, like in Pakistan, to set up their agencies so they can deal with it. And there's a lot of money available, and I agree with what the panelists said, but we need to be more efficient. We cannot be writing blank checks anymore.
And tap into these emerging economies and get countries like Russia and China to perhaps feel a bit more responsibility. This was a fantastic panel. Tom, yes?
Not just countries like Russia and China. I'm saying the countries like Ethiopia and countries like Pakistan and India, there's a lot of money. There's more millionaires in Mumbai than there are in New York. That's the city with the most millionaires in the world, is Mumbai in India. So it's nice about India, Russia and China, but I'm saying there's a lot of money out there that we can tap into.
Thank you. Tom Stahl, Anwar Khan, Ray Offenheiser. Round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Don't go anywhere. The next panel starts in just a few minutes. Thank you all.
Kim and panelists, thank you so much for this discussion, a very wonderful discussion. We're going to do a quick transition to our second panel. I'd like to invite our panelists here. Our second panel, which will take a deeper dive in the plight of the displaced and what can be done about it, will be moderated by Howard LaFranchi. Howard has been at the Christian Science Monitors since 2001 and has been their diplomacy correspondent. Previously, he spent 12 years as a reporter in the field, serving 5 years as the Monitor's Paris bureau chief from '89 to '94, and as a Latin American correspondent in Mexico City from '94 to 2001. This time, everyone would take their places.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry. Thank you for all being here. I was at Istanbul at the summit and covering the summit, and I found many inspiring innovations. There was something called the Innovation Marketplace, where there were hundreds, really, of NGOs, of individuals bringing their ideas for improving the lot of the rising number of refugees and displaced people. There were, as I say, there were inspiring ideas. Really, I think one of the most touching things I saw was a photo exhibit where a photographer had dressed young Palestinian girls in the in the uniforms of the careers they aspired to. And so you had these pictures of a girl in an astronaut's outfit, a girl in a nurse's uniform, a girl in a classroom, one is in a pharmacy, and one as a homemaker. And you know, it was as they say, inspiring. But the summit wrapped up with two things. One, a press conference by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, where he noted the absence, as Nancy mentioned, of the world leaders, of the top, most powerful leaders from the summit. And that press conference was followed by a closing event with a chorus of refugee children from Syria. And I couldn't help but think that as they sang beautifully, that those leaders, the leaders of the Security Council should have been there, the leaders of the G7, to hear those children. Because as Ban Ki-moon made the point, and others that I spoke with at this innovation marketplace, the point they made was it can't be about better and bigger Band-Aids all the time. The need is constantly outsized. And the point now, what has to happen now is prevention and focusing more on either preventing conflicts from happening, as Nancy noted, with the great shift to in humanitarian needs to addressing conflict and the victims of conflict, that the answer can no longer be just doing more and better humanitarian intervention, but actually conflict prevention, and then when conflicts do arise, conflict resolution. And so I'm hoping that today we're going to, here on our panel, we're going to talk about this rising number of refugees and just displaced people, but also what some of the answers are, what needs to happen, not only to address their needs, but to also to reduce conflict, to end conflict, to prevent conflict. And I think we do have a couple of events coming up where maybe those leaders who were absent from the summit, maybe they have a second chance. And so I think today, maybe on our panel, we'll talk about some of those other events coming up and what some of the steps might be taken, where leaders together with organizations, with the private sector may go in this critical area of crisis prevention, building resilient communities, and crisis and conflict resolution. So I think we have a great panel here today. I'll start here with Fadi Haliso. Fadi is a native of Aleppo and has been providing relief and development assistance to refugees for a decade. First to the Iraqi refugees who poured into Syria during the Iraq War, and then more recently to Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Turkey through the relief organization that he co-founded, Basme and Zaytuna. Then we have Anne Richard. Anne, thank you for being here. Anne has served as Assistant Secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration since 2012. Anne has dedicated much of her career to government service, serving in positions at the State Department and at OMB, but she has also filled some impressive shoes outside of government, serving as Vice President at the International Rescue Committee, and playing a lead role on the team of experts that created the International Crisis Group. And I think maybe Kim and I especially are hoping that Anne will provide a couple of scoops for us on President Obama's initiative for a global refugee crisis summit that will take place at the UN General Assembly in September. Next to Anne, we have Elizabeth Ferris. Elizabeth is putting her decades of experience in the humanitarian field to good work at her current post as Senior Advisor to the UN General Assembly's high-level meeting. I've now been told has now become a summit because of the number of heads of state and government who have accepted to attend. So what we will now call the summit meeting on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. And that's set for September 19th in New York. President Obama's summit will then take place the next day on September 20th. Elizabeth has deep experience on both the aid delivery and academic sides of the humanitarian aid system. She's now a research professor at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service and specializes in internal displacement at Brookings, where she recently published the provocatively titled paper, Serious Humanitarian Crisis and the Failure to Protect. So thank you all for being here. And I think I'd like to start, if I may, with you, Fadi, and just your decade of experience, not only what you find works in addressing the needs of refugees, but maybe if you have any clues as to where the international community may go in terms of building more resilient communities and resolving conflict so that the needs don't continue to arise again and again.
Thank you. First of all, let me start by saying I do not share the optimism that was on this panel before regarding the World Humanitarian Summit at all. Actually, from a Syrian point of view and as a Syrian with few of my colleagues, we were quite disappointed of how things are going around Syria. So we sent a letter to the summit entitled Evolve or Dissolve. Because we feel deeply disappointed by the failure of the humanitarian system in general and the international community to protect Syrians, to protect the civilians. And it seems that there is a deadlock, a paralysis in this regard, that nothing could happen. In our discussions with politicians, with Secretary of State, the discussion come to the point where we should go to war with Russia to stop the bombardment of hospitals and schools. So yeah, the scene is very disappointing. On one hand, on the other hand, we keep going on from one conference to another summit to another workshop where very amazing pledges are made on behalf of the refugees, on behalf of Syrians, or for the humanitarian system, but very little development is taking place. At the contrary, since last summer we've seen the closure of the borders in front of refugees, especially the Syrians. All the surrounding countries have shut down their borders. Turkey also has closed the road to Europe. Borders inside Europe are being shut down. And meanwhile, no real efforts is being made in the surrounding countries to improve the life of refugees. So the talk about the resilience is, for me, a little bit out of its place, because there is a lot of effort to be made beforehand. There is a lot of nice talk about, we heard in the previous panel about empowering local actors, but the practice we've seen on the ground is very disappointing in this regard. Lately, there was a report launched by Local to Global initiative around Syria, mentioning that out of the $2.1 billion spent on Syrian crisis in 2014, only 0.3 went directly to Syrian local humanitarian actors. Out of it, only 9.3% was indirect funding. And indirect funding comes with restrictions. When it comes through INGOs, it means mainly that local humanitarian actors are deprived from the overhead, and which means they are not able to sustain themselves, to build their capacity, and to graduate from these capacity building schools that we are not able to graduate from. So it is a vicious circle for many of us. We've seen that there is a lot of progress to be made, but first of all, there is a need for a political decision to be made. It was really disappointing to see the world leaders absent from the summit. It was like if the humanitarians were talking to each other, where they were celebrating their work and themselves, but there is no hope for real change. What is the purpose of having summits and pledges and commitments if there is no one able to make the countries accountable to what they are committing, what they are pledging? If there are security resolutions made to protect the civilians, but no one is making the effort, so...
Yes, so, Anne, do you think... I realize you're not the president, but was this clearly there was this plea all the way from the top from Secretary General Ban for global leadership, especially in this area of prevention and conflict prevention. And was that message heard, and how is that going, and if it was, and how does the President's Summit, is the President's Summit just a Band-Aid, or how does that summit, which has a great title and looks to address what is this burgeoning number of refugees, how is that going to address this issue, and again this crucial element of world leadership? Was that heard?
Well, I was able to attend the World Humanitarian Summit as part of our delegation, which was composed of people led by Gail Smith, the administrator of USAID, people with decades of experience working on foreign assistance, on development and humanitarian assistance, and it even included a couple of veterans of humanitarian operations overseas. So a lot of people who have been in and out of government working with the top-notch non-governmental organizations, in Gail's case, starting advocacy groups. And so I think if you look at the actual people who the U.S. sent, it was an impressive group who know a lot about the issues, as opposed to people who have a role in the photo op that takes place in about 5 minutes of the summit. The summit was a 12-ring circus, I'd say. There were Hollywood stars, there was media, there was an exhibition space with a lot of hardworking, thoughtful people trying to surface smart ideas. There was much more going on than any one person could attend, and that was a frustration because in terms of the issues that my bureau cares about, that cares about refugees, migration, and also reproductive health needs of women, I could have attended 16 events at once and had something to say or learned from them. And so I found it a frustrating place to be in terms of trying to be everywhere at once. And so we tried to make the best use of our time, showing up, speaking up, getting messages out. We had 2 to 3 minutes to speak at most of these events. Messages that maybe to this audience is not, radically new. We should protect women and girls, but that need to be heard by some of those governments and some of those leaders from parts of the world where women and girls are not being protected. So I thought that we were smart in how we approached it and how we used our time. In terms of
So if, as you say, the people who know the issue, and as opposed to those who would be in the photo op, we know who that is, but the people, if the officials who know the issues were there, how are they going to carry that forward, first of all, towards September? What is the purpose of the summit in September?
Well, let's talk about that because this is, I think, the president's decision about how he uses his time is where is he going to make the biggest impact. And he's decided that looking at the global refugee and migration crisis that's going on today, that he could organize an event in New York in September where real change would be accomplished in terms of raising real money, getting actual places for refugees to be resettled or get to safety in other countries, and then also getting countries that host a lot of refugees to adopt policies to make the lives of those refugees more fulfilling in the places to which they've fled. So they get more kids in school and get the ability for refugees to work and take care of themselves and take care of their families and live as much as a normal life as possible. Fadi, I can't argue with some of the things he's reporting about what he sees out there in terms of civilians not being protected in war zones and international humanitarian law and humanitarian principles not being observed inside Syria and in places in Iraq that are being overrun by ISIL, for example. But this is this event in September 20th, the Leaders Summit on refugees, would be an opportunity to encourage countries to actually do more than they have before. The entire event is modeled on a peacekeeping summit that the president led last September, where countries were encouraged to provide more troops, more equipment, and more funding for peacekeeping. And that was very successful. And so building on that event, that became then the model for this year's event. This year's event, though, I think, it's a tougher sell. It's a tougher sell. I'm, talking to foreign government officials who host lots and lots of refugees and have for decades and asking them to do more. And they're coming back and saying, well, why do you care now and not in the past? Right. And what are you going to do to help us do more? And so this is the sort of the flavor of the conversation that we're having right now with governments around the world.
And so, Elizabeth, the day before President Obama's summit, there will be another summit. Could you tell us a little bit about that, how that's shaping up, and how that fits into this effort really spearheaded by the Secretary General to not only to address but to do better at addressing the needs of refugees and the millions of displaced.
There are a lot of summits going on this year, and I think they represent kind of a collective yearning to fix something. We haven't got it right. And so we're trying in the UN General Assembly Summit on the 19th of September to build on the World Humanitarian Summit, which was a different animal. As Nancy pointed out, it was a different kind of meeting. The 19th of September Summit will be an intergovernmental process. Negotiations on the outcome document started an hour and 11 minutes ago. They have about 2 months to put together recommendations, a resolution, a declaration, which the plan at least will be adopted by consensus on the morning of the 19th. This is a tricky diplomatic process. I'm involved with the Secretariat, which prepared the Secretary General's report that made a lot of recommendations, which we hope will be taken up by the diplomats and will result in some concrete outcome. We're working very closely with those organizing President Obama's summit, which focuses on commitments by individual states, which is crucial, but we're trying to focus on the system. 1 million people arrived in Europe in the past year. This should not be a crisis. Europe has 550 million people. If our systems for sharing responsibility and being able and prepared to respond to this kind of influx were in place, this should not be a crisis. In developing the report and preparing for the summit, like you, we've heard from a lot of governments who say, yeah, Europe has a crisis. What about us in Kenya? Or what about us in Central African Republic or Central America? And so trying to balance the urgency that the world has seized upon in the case of Syria and people coming from many other countries to Europe with the global needs has been a challenge. We've also faced the challenge of dealing with how shall I say, conflicting messages around migration and refugees. Migration is good. Migration is a driver of development and economic growth. And at the same time, what we've seen happening in the Mediterranean and Central America and lots of other places is the irregular migration and people using very dangerous routes to escape indicates that our systems aren't equipped to deal with this kind of movement of people. So the report makes recommendations for dealing with refugees and for migrants, strengthening our systems of international governance of migration, and also some common issues that affect both this horrible, toxic narrative, xenophobic narrative that we see, not just in Europe and North America, but in many places in the world. How do we counter that? How do we deal with questions of integrating refugees and migrants into societies, which is a security issue as well as a human rights issue? So lots of issues, a very high-risk environment to be putting some of these proposals out there. And it will be, I think we're all holding our breath to see if, in fact, the world's leaders do take advantage of this historic, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create a system that can somehow deal with these pressures.
So what do you see as the outcome at the end of the General Assembly Summit? You spoke about a resolution. What do you foresee, and what will that matter?
What we've hoped to see is, one, an adoption of a global compact on responsibility sharing for refugees, a commitment in advance that next time there's a large movement, we will all step up. And call on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to develop, at the beginning of a crisis, a comprehensive plan. We've got lots of good examples of comprehensive plans bringing in development actors and so on after 5 or 10 years or more. But couldn't we start that process a little earlier? A process to come up with an international system of governance for migration that includes more safe, regular, orderly pathways so people don't have to take to rickety boats and trek across deserts to find some kind of future for themselves. We want to bring the International Organization for Migration, the world's largest, most competent migration agency, into the United Nations. Right now it's an intergovernmental organization outside of that. We know that there are lots of people who flee who don't qualify as refugees under the 1951 Refugee Convention, but who have serious protection needs. They're called forced migrants, vulnerable migrants, crisis migrants, survival migrants, but there is no consensus on who they are, how they should be treated. Could we set up a process to develop some guidance? So next time people arrive on borders, we aren't starting from scratch and inventing how we deal with it. So I think there are some concrete things that we hope will come up. But it all comes down to political will and commitment. And frankly, I have great hopes for civil society, which will be on the margins of the summit, but which has a crucial role to play in terms of pressing governments, encouraging governments, not only to make commitments, but also designing perhaps some little follow-up mechanisms to hold people accountable for decisions that are eventually, hopefully, made in New York.
I think one of the really biggest, most daunting challenges that I think came out, at least if nothing else, that the summit sort of provided a mouthpiece for. Just the reality today that the length of time that a refugee or a displaced person is away from home has extended now to what's said to be on average 17 years. And there's some controversy about how that number was arrived at. But whether in fact the average is 15 years or 20 years, the point is that that's a generation. That's for a child, that's education. For a young person, that's the period almost of a career. And so that's just as someone from actually from USAID was telling me, it's not just the refugees and displaced from conflict, although that's a big part of it, but even with natural disasters, more intense today, hitting increasingly urbanized areas, that even the people displaced by natural disasters, what the U.S. Through USAID in setting up intervention teams to go in, once thought in terms of months, now it's extended to years. And so what, Fadi, in your work, how are local organizations coming to grips and dealing with this, with really this extended length of time that people are either displaced or in refugee status? What are some of the things that need to happen to meet the needs of those people? New needs, different needs.
In the Syrian case, and even the Iraqi case before, it was obvious that it is a long crisis. So the response should be taking this into consideration. And people are immigrating because they are seeing no hope for the future. Because Syrians in Lebanon, for instance, where I'm based, cannot be convinced that they are going to be returning soon, and cannot be convinced to stay in Lebanon in those awful conditions, where many people are still residing for the 5th year under tents in the Beqa Valley that get trapped with snow every year, with no opportunity to work, no right to work, with a lot of kids out of schooling. They cannot be convinced that to stay in Lebanon so they might return to Syria, because first they don't see any prospect of their return in the coming 1 or 2 years. Second, they don't have the means to survive. Meanwhile, the aid money is dropping, and I understand very well that we cannot keep distributing food and blankets and NFIs forever for people. So we need to do something. We need to help them work and provide for themselves and their families. Fortunately, in London Donors Conference, big pledges were made for livelihood. But unfortunately, we haven't seen much progress being done on these aspects in the surrounding countries in regards of legislation and giving the refugees the right to work. Yes, Turkey's government has done this, but also they have put some quota limits on Syrians. The Jordanians are making small improvements on this regard. In Lebanon, there is nothing being done. Unfortunately, the mentality in Lebanon is that they don't want to repeat the Palestinian precedent by having refugees temporarily, then stay forever. So the only way they seem to have in mind is to make their life as miserable as possible, so to drive them out. So, as there is no way to go back to Syria, of course they will try to go wherever it is possible around the world, whether to Europe or to any place else. And by blocking the roads to Europe, we are only forcing them to take more dangerous roads. What we are trying to do is trying as much as possible to provide people with hope, with as little as hope as we can. Yes, we cannot find those legislation unless we have support of our friends who can talk to the authorities. But what we can do is start on a small level. As for us, on the grassroots level, saving the life of one person is rewarding enough. So what we are trying to do is to help people get back to their normal life, create job opportunities as much as possible, though it is not always possible with the legal framework, current legal framework. And this is, and meanwhile train them and provide them with the skills necessary for them to use in Syria to rebuild the country when they are back. But this is a big challenge, and to tell you the truth, it seems that we are fighting this fight on our own.
Well, I saw on your organization's website different approaches you're taking, training women, for example, helping women to learn a craft or something where they can become breadwinners and help support their families. But Anne, in your comments, you mentioned both education and employment opportunities. And so how is the U.S. government, as Fadi mentioned, there is some progress. Both Turkey and Jordan have moved in the direction of allowing some of the millions of refugees in those countries to go to work. And on education, I think perhaps we'll find that one of the most concrete and promising results of the Humanitarian Summit was a new education initiative that was announced by Gordon Brown, the UN's education envoy, that was really going to focus on trying to make sure that there is no lost generation in terms of education. And
education cannot wait.
Education cannot wait, exactly. And because, as Gordon Brown said, there is that risk of a lost generation. And as the previous panel was talking about, national interests, and it's clearly, even if just viewed from a national interest perspective, it's in no country's interest to have a whole generation of young people who have no education, no hope, and might look elsewhere for a future. So how is the U.S. Addressing those two questions? What's being done there?
Well, I mean, before talking about those specific questions, I just want to say, the U.S. is a leader on the humanitarian assistance, on diplomacy of trying to resolve some of these conflicts, and by sending diplomats to the field, including my boss, Secretary Kerry, going out and trying the hard slog of trying to convince people to put down their weapons, talk to each other, and have peace. And we're also a leader in the formal program to resettle refugees, taking 70,000 refugees to resettle in the U.S. each of the last 3 years, and then aiming to do more this year. Those numbers pale, I realize, in comparison to the numbers of migrants and refugees walking into Europe. But this is a piece of how the U.S. has always behaved in ensuring that we were a leader in responding to crises around the world. So there's an underlying base of how the world responds that, while not sufficient to resolve all the crises right now, is an important piece, an important constructive, positive piece of saving a lot of lives right now. We are the world leader in humanitarian assistance to all the top UN organizations that are providing food and shelter and protection to people in a lot of very dangerous places. So it's not perfect, but it's more than any other country does, and certainly any other donor country does. And so that's the backdrop. And so we know that it's not enough and that more has to be done. So we are trying to get other countries to do more, and that's part of the President's Summit. We are also finding better ways of providing assistance. And that gets to your question then, of if these situations can't be resolved in the short term, if they can't be treated like short-term emergencies, the way sometimes natural disasters can be resolved, by competent aid workers and countries, well-governed countries, then what more can we do to help people not just survive that initial flight, but then have fuller lives? Because what's clear is that, and I'm speaking about refugees and displaced people, they don't want to be dependent for decades and see their children born and grow up in these very artificial camp environments. They want to take care of themselves. They want to be self-sufficient. They want to thrive and have full lives, not just survive. And so education is a key piece of that. Our delegation announced $20 million contribution to that education cannot wait. Half from AID, half from our office, because so many of the people who need the education are refugees. But that's intended to be, I know Gail Smith is very tough-minded on this, it's intended to be seed money to get the program started, but it really is a challenge to the organizers of education cannot wait to raise more money from the private sector, raise more money from new donor governments that perhaps haven't done a lot in the past. In terms of people being allowed to work and take care of themselves, that's less about us providing assistance to countries to build schools and take care of both their local kids and the refugee kids, but also to change their policies. So, and part of that is a mindset that we see sometimes in our own country, that if new people are coming in, they're going to take our jobs, they're going to steal our jobs, and we're all going to lose. And so this is where we need economists to ride to the rescue and explain and make the case, which I think can be made, but it's up to them to prove it, that if you bring in these highly motivated people, if you do the right thing and through humanity, you act on your humanity and generosity and bring in people and allow them to take care of themselves, everybody actually will end up better off because they will be an engine for your economy and they can contribute so much. We've seen this in the United States. The refugees we've resettled can be some of the hardest working, motivated staff members of any enterprise. But we never get that far in some countries because they are so threatened, or they feel that even if they understand this at the top of the governments, they feel that they can't explain it to their publics why they would do so much for foreigners coming in when their own citizens have needs. So it's clear that for most people working in the refugee world, you don't just provide humanitarian aid to the refugees. You also find a way to deliver development assistance in a constructive way to the societies that have done the right thing, especially poor societies that have done the right thing in taking in people, and you help them invest in their water and sanitation, build out hospitals, and renovate schools so that both communities can live well side by side. That's the vision. Fadi can tell us, how, give us a report card on how it's actually, being carried out in the countries we're talking about. I think it's very hard to do. But what I find remarkable is in the people who do long-term development, there is a whole new sense of a need to work together with humanitarians. And you see the head of the World Bank shifting the whole direction of the World Bank in pushing his colleagues to work in crisis zones and to figure out what kind of instruments or mechanisms they can use to help these countries that are doing the right thing and taking in refugees.
Something else that I was really struck by in Istanbul at the summit and looking at some of the private sector involvement in humanitarian assistance, the growing participation of the private sector, but the number of companies that are getting involved or were in Istanbul finding ways to get involved because they know that, first of all, as you were saying, that there's a pool of hard workers there, people who don't have, maybe don't have or are taken away from their activity, their normal activity, but they're good hard workers, they want to participate. Also, the companies realize that it's, in the long run, it's very good for their image. And so, that was encouraging to see that involvement growing. But Elizabeth, I'm wondering, as Anne was saying, it's really, in many ways, and as Fadi said as well, the key will be getting the countries that receive refugee populations and displaced to change their laws and to allow people to work and to allow children to go to school and to buy into some of these new initiatives to expand education. So will there be, can we expect to see something coming out of the either the resolution or the General Assembly Summit that will really, I know use of force is something that maybe that's not even very well exercised by the Security Council, but that can really push countries in the direction of opening up in those two areas of education and economic involvement, jobs.
I think there's a general consensus emerging that education, jobs, livelihoods are the key to integration, to long-term refugee displacement situations generally. You know, we've been hearing about this development humanitarian divide for at least 25 years. I'm more encouraged now than I ever have been, in part because of changes at the World Bank. You know, when you were talking, Anne, I was thinking about some of the studies the World Bank has done that shows pretty conclusively that worldwide refugees and migrants are a tremendous positive economic advantage. They can be a short-term shock when support is needed to deal with the initial adjustment of receiving so many people. But in terms of economic growth, in terms of education, in terms of contributions to the society, I think Germany is going to come out of this as a real economic winner, and not just as an expression of generosity and compassion, which it also deserves admiration for. But I think we need to start saying that loud and clear. It isn't just something you're doing for these poor people, but this is a way in which you can contribute, help your own society as well. So I think that there are some really positive things that are happening out there. But it takes a mind shift, to see refugees and displaced people not just as humanitarian, but as a development issue, to include them in development plans, to be able to access development funds. These are slow, bureaucratic things to change, but I think we are seeing some movement on that. And I hope, too, we're starting to see some recognition that our immediate response systems need to be better in terms of how we receive large numbers of refugees and migrants. I was doing a little bit of historical research this week looking for past examples where the international community had responded well, and was reading about the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, when something like 180,000 refugees poured across the border into Austria. And I was amazed to see that in 10 weeks, 100,000 of them were resettled. 100,000 out of 180,000 were resettled in 10 weeks. It took 2 years to deal with the other 80,000 who, for some reasons, were more difficult. But, I think 1956 to 2016, maybe we should go back and look at some of those historical examples and see if, the world is more complicated and our systems are more complex, but by golly, if we got it right in 1956, surely we could do a little bit better in 2016.
Well, let's hope that perhaps these events and can put more of a positive, this positive, cast a positive light on the place of refugees and what the roles they can play in the countries that receive them. I know many of us feel that, if anything, the tendency that we see on a daily basis is in fact in the other direction, whether it's the European Union sending out boats, supposedly to save refugees, but really what it looks like is to keep them bottled up and to keep them from coming forward. In our own country, we certainly can't puff up our chests and vaunt our response when I think the last numbers I heard on even a woefully small commitment to accept, what was it, 1,000 Syrian refugees?
We're going to bring
10,000. Sorry, 10,000. But in April anyway, I think the number was just around 1,000 that we had managed to bring in. So I don't know if we're doing better on that. But
yeah,
before we are okay. Where are we now?
We're going to bring in 10,000 this year.
Okay, we're going to make it. Okay, all right. And Canada, by the way, has been a great example.
They brought 25,000, and they're going to continue.
Really amazing. But before we open to questions, I would just like to ask each one of you quickly. Okay, so if you had the audience, you had an audience with the Security Council, all 5 of those top leaders, and so on this question of getting beyond the better Band-Aid to preventing conflict, what would you say? What needs to happen?
I don't know if there is any point of talking to the Security Council because it has already failed us enough through the last 5 years.
Here's our resident realist here. Okay.
No, really. I mean, what could have been done 5 years ago to preserve us from reaching this point was much simpler than what is needed now. So I don't have much hope. But what I hope, whom I talk to right now, is the citizens in the countries where we visit. We ask them to do more, to push their governments to do more, because if Europe is nagging about 1 million refugees and consider it as a crisis, what a small country like Lebanon with 4 million residents say about receiving 1.5 million refugees? So, yes, we are doing our best in pressuring the Lebanese government to change the legal framework, but how even the most compassionate Lebanese politician would justify the change of legal framework when he sees a whole entire entire European continent is nagging about 1 million refugees. So there is much more efforts to do in each country to push the governments to do more in regard to refugees, in receiving more, and not to be that much selective, because unfortunately most of the resettlements program are favoring the upper middle class refugees, the educated ones who can easily be integrated into society, who can easily find a job, or even some favoritism towards the minorities, which needs to be ended, because this is putting more pressure and create more dangers for the minorities who are staying back home.
Yes. Anne.
I don't believe all countries are created equal. So when I hear criticisms of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council or the G7, except Angela Merkel, I think it requires looking a little deeper at, which countries are investing time and attention in trying to negotiate and sue for peace, and which ones are involved in bombing innocent people, which countries are, sovereign governments are responsible for protecting their own citizens. Who's bombing their own citizens? Who's dropping barrel bombs on innocent people, and then who's instead sending out diplomats trying to, trying against the odds to wage peace. And so
So would your plea be to hold responsible, and I think we all know who you're referring to, with barrel bombs. So
I think that the U.S. is trying to, as a member of these bodies, trying to do the right thing, but can't do it by fiat. And that diplomacy is really, really difficult. And the sad part is that the consequences are felt by children and innocent people and families who, despite coming from places at war, are not combatants, are not terrorists, and are just trying to live peaceful lives like all of us would. So we can't give up. We have to keep trying, but it is terrible that this is continuing on to yet another year of war.
Elizabeth, I mentioned your recent paper on the failure to protect. And it's a sad commentary years after the entire General Assembly adopted the responsibility to protect as a principle. So what would you plea for? What would you call for?
We talked to 80 different governments in preparing the Secretary General's report. Every single one of them said our number one priority is to address the causes of refugee flows, drivers of migration. And yet when you dig a little deeper, we've got all the statements that we know what needs to be done. Stop the violence, respect human rights, alleviate poverty. We have dozens of declarations and recommendations. What we need to do is implement them and find some way of holding governments accountable. And if I can just say one word about U.S. policy, I've also been very critical of the low number of Syrians that have been resettled in the U.S. But if you look beyond resettlement, the U.S. has been a leader in terms of driving a humanitarian response. Sometimes we just kind of toss off the amount of money that the U.S. U.S. has put in. But that has been critical. You know, we wouldn't be where we are. Things would be 1,000 times worse without U.S. money and also without U.S. energy. It isn't just about money. I mean, I see it now at the UN, and I've never worked for the U.S. government, but I see it now at the UN that the respect the U.S. is held in because of the energy and thought and compassion. It isn't just about money or numbers. So, I mean, I can be critical of the 2,500 Syrian refugees. It should be much more, but I think the U.S. has done a good job on humanitarian issues. More can be done, but it isn't enough to just look at those paltry numbers and say the U.S. isn't doing enough. Anyway.
Great, thank you. Okay, I see a number of hands already, so we have microphones coming down, and again, as Kim mentioned, I'll just repeat, please keep your questions short, identify yourself. We'll start here, woman in the white sweater, and we'll
Hi there. I'm Penny Starr with CNS News, and I have some statistics. The State Department Refugee Processing Center is reporting that the May figure of Syrian refugees was 1,037. This is actually an increase of 130% over the previous month. So that's stats from the State Department. My question is, though, there's a report that of those 1,037 Syrian refugees, only 2 of those are Christian. The rest are Muslim. And I just wondered if I could ask you why that is the case. Thank you.
You know, we are bringing people, this also gets back to something that you were saying about who do we resettle. And we have been accused by some governments that we go in and we skim off the cream of the crop. We take the people who will be the most successful because they look at our program and see all these successful refugees. Well, we don't do it that way. We take the most vulnerable people, including sometimes religious minorities of all types of religions, even though I get asked the most by members of Congress about Christians. We take Christians, we take Muslims, we take Buddhists, we take Jews from parts of the world, and because we are trying to help the most vulnerable people. We also take people who are LGBT, we take people who have been torture victims, we take people who have really severe medical needs, burn victims, because maybe they'll be able to get the kind of medical care here in the U.S. that you just can't get in the places to which they've fled in the neighborhood around Syria or in whatever country they fled from. So this means that for that fraction of the world's refugees that come to the U.S., they will get a chance to restart their lives. And it's an incredibly challenging thing to go through. But the refugees I meet in the U.S. are very grateful for that, and they really grab a hold of the opportunity. If they're, sometimes in a family there may be somebody who can't really work again if they've been traumatized by war, but there might be other family members who really can and start small business or really, really support the rest of the family. So this piece that we are taking, the well-off, the middle class, that's not the intention of our program, and it's, I think if you meet refugees in the U.S., you often meet people who didn't speak English originally, were not business people. The refugees who are coming across from Jordan, for example, are coming from rural areas of southern Syria, and they were farmers. So they're going to, I meet a lot of people who were farmers. They're now doing gardening in cities across the U.S., urban garden space, because they're from Bhutan or they're from Burma. And so, we are finding a place for them in our society. In terms of bringing the numbers that you're looking at for the Syrians, I would say, to get to your question earlier too, we're over 40% of the way towards that 10,000. But what we've done is we've sent a group to Jordan to move the process faster, and something we haven't been able to do before. We have very good interagency cooperation with the security and law enforcement folks who have to do the security vetting. And so this should deliver and is online to deliver a lot more Syrians arriving in the U.S. in the next few months than arrived in the first few months. And so that's why I'm saying with confidence that we'll reach the 10,000. So is it enough? in terms of rescuing all the refugees from Syria? Well, it will never be enough because it's only going to be a fraction of the Syrians who come this way. The solution for most Syrian refugees that would be best would be peace in Syria and being able to go home. And secondarily, a better life in the places to which they fled. So we have to do all of this. We have to get aid as much as we can inside Syria. We have to sue for peace. We have to help the people who are in the neighborhood. We have to encourage the people who are concerned about refugees going even further afield and taking dangerous journeys. We have to all work together so they don't feel forced to do that in order to live full lives. And we have to resettle some piece of the world's refugees to show who we are, to demonstrate our humanity, and to actually revitalize and benefit our own country.
And the religious breakdown, is that anything
Oh,
that...
you know, we take a lot more Christians from Iraq, actually. 40% of the refugees we've brought from Iraq are Christian because of who was fleeing. And in Syria, there haven't been significant numbers of Christian refugees fleeing and then registering and then being referred. And it's partly because of the makeup of Syrian society. So I think on all these numbers, which I know the press are really focusing on, you have to look deeper into the story, I think, to get the full story.
Okay, I think Fadi wanted to say something.
Yeah, in other cases, there are governments who are saying very clearly that they won't accept but Christians. I am a Syrian Christian, and I feel very offended of the way of segregating us in a religious manner. Yeah. This is totally wrong. All Syrians are being affected by the crisis, whatever their background is. They need to be helped and resettled regardless of their religious affiliation. And really, when the Belgian government has resettled 250 Christians from Aleppo, my hometown, in a secret operation through Lebanon, it created a lot of backlash on the Christians who remained in Aleppo.
Okay, let's go on. We have an enthusiastic hand coming up right here. So.
Thank you again. Fadi, thank you so much for actually highlighting. I'm Lucy from Yazidi Relief Fund. Thank you so much for highlighting the treatment of refugees who are receiving in Turkey. I attend many conferences, and to hear this type of statement, it's very highly rare. So my question will be this way. We see Kobani and Afrin. They are people, and people are trapped because the humanitarian aid border has been blockaded, both from Turkish side and from KRG side, Iraqi Kurdistan. So we've been asking so many times US government to moderate between these countries, at least to get the humanitarian aid, because there are people who want to flee, but there are so many people who wanted to stay. For example, in Kobani, so many Kurds, they went back to totally destroyed city. They don't want to go back to Europe or Turkey and be treated the way how Fadi just described. So they wanted to stay. And there are so many NGOs, foreign NGOs in Turkey, who are prevent from Turkish government to operate in Syria, as well as in KRG. So my question to State Department, are you moderating, or are you some kind of, doing anything to let this humanitarian aid to go through? Thank you.
But don't hand back the microphone yet, because I didn't completely understand what your point was, because you described a certain dynamic in the neighborhood.
Yeah, the humanitarian aid.
So the specific question is.
Yeah, humanitarian aid doesn't go through because it should go through Turkey to Syria, and there are borders between, let's say, Afrin and Kobani, and Turkey is closed. So, for example, there are so many containers full of clothing or, dry food. It's still there since 2014. And the fees to transfer from Turkey to Syria are so high that make no sense to pay for it, So there is no humanitarian aid that goes to Syria to keep those refugees or people there and to support them.
So what the U.S. government does is it supports trying to get aid in through all channels, whatever channels work. into Syria. And I'm saying this, and Nancy Lindborg, who's now the president of USAID, used to say this when she was in her job and tried to make this happen. So her words are actually echoing in my ears. To try to get aid in through whatever channels work. So part of that is from Damascus out, but that doesn't cover the whole country. And part of it is trying to get in through other means. And there has been success in getting aid across borders and into the country and to hard to reach areas. But every day it's a challenge. And there are combatants on the ground who are stopping aid at checkpoints, who are keeping aid workers out. And this has been, for years now, a struggle to make the case that there should be what's called humanitarian access. The aid should be allowed to get in. We have actually gotten more aid in recent months than ever before, but it's still not good enough. The idea of containers sitting for years, though, should not be happening. And so on that, if you have facts and figures about that, we need to get them to Tom Stahl to do something about that. But aid is getting in. It's not just stopped, but it's not reaching everyone who needs it.
All right, I think we have time for maybe two more, and if we could take two together. I think we have one here, and anybody over here that I ignored. And then there's a hand up here in the black jacket.
Hi, this is Kari Reed with Save the Children. Thank you very much for this panel. It's been very, very informative, and it covered a lot of ground. But one issue that I heard missing from the discussion is addressing the biggest refugee and asylum seeker flow coming into the U.S., and by that I mean Central Americans and those fleeing violence from the Northern Triangle in Mexico. So given this big upcoming summit that the U.S. is hosting in September, I'm wondering what the U.S. is doing and planning to do to address this crisis.
And the second question?
Yeah, hi, Sarah Williamson from Protect the People. My question is in regard to a global comprehensive plan of action, and it's a two-part question. Could you address a little bit the role of the Gulf states in this crisis, and do you think there are other forms of protection that states can offer that don't want to open up to resettlement, such as temporary protected status for Syrians in other regions of the world?
Okay, great. Maybe Anne, could you talk about Central America, and Elizabeth, talk about the second question.
On Central America, which I work on in my voluminous free time when I'm not working on these other crises, you are absolutely right in describing the phenomenon, and we're paying attention there too. And it's often raised actually by Europeans when we're meeting with them. They go, but you have people coming too. It's like, yes, we know. And so there is no one solution to that situation. We see in the three Northern Triangle countries of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, that innocent people are being terrorized by criminal gangs, and they are running for their lives. And even if one generation feels safe, sometimes they're worried about the younger generation. And these are also places where there may be, have family in the United States, and part of the family is still in Central America. So we've done a number of things. The most important thing is to address the root causes, to go after the criminal gangs. And so that's what part of the US government is trying to tackle. And we've also gotten funding from Congress to try to invest more in this area, and other parts of the US government are looking at the development programs, the law enforcement programs, the security programs that can help address then the root cause so that people don't have to flee in the first place. Our piece from my bureau is that we started a modest program to try to bring children to the United States to reunify with their parents if the parent, one or the other parent, was lawfully present in the United States, so that they wouldn't have to make this very dangerous journey up through Mexico to the border alone or in the hands of unscrupulous smugglers. so-called coyotes. So we are seeing that program start to take off too, and we're trying to accelerate that. We're also trying to work with UNHCR and with countries in the region to see if there's ways, if people really feel threatened, that they are helped to safety nearby, rather than feeling very much on their own and that they have to set out on this dangerous journey. So that is something we're working on actively right now. And of course, this involves a lot of US politicians and policymakers, state governments, Department of Homeland Security, looking at the border areas of the southwest US border in terms of what is the reception for people there, how are people who come across there seeking asylum, how are they helped, what are the judgments when some of these folks don't easily fit the definition of a refugee the way Elizabeth was talking before. So is there a gap there? Should our country help them and treat them as refugees if they're fleeing criminal gangs? And I think more and more immigration judges are determining, yes, they do fit the definition of a refugee and should be allowed in. So that's another piece of it. But from the State Department point of view, we want to help them before they get to the southwest border. We want to do more so that they don't feel the need to flee, or they don't have to travel so far, and they certainly don't have to fall prey to criminals on their route to safety.
Okay, thank you. And Elizabeth, so what do you see as what are you seeing in terms of Gulf state participation, both in the upcoming summit and otherwise, and any movement in the region to step up in terms of working with and protecting the displaced and refugees in the region?
Yeah, maybe take the second part of Sarah's question first, which was, I think a really positive thing that's happened this past year has been a recognition that refugee resettlement isn't the only way for people to reach safety. And we're talking now about more alternative pathways, labor mobility, scholarships, let people have opportunities to study abroad for a few years, Syrians and elsewhere. I think there's a real move in that. And the Gulf states have often said, we're not taking many refugees. Our ability, they're not providing perhaps sufficient economic support, but they are hosting a large number of workers from the Middle East, from Syria and other countries who are sending remittances home. So I think that may be one way in which they could provide more support to Syrians and others who are in need of assistance through means other than traditional resettlement or traditional financial contributions.
And specifically at the summit, do you see, are they active? Are the Gulf states
We've talked with a number of Gulf states. We haven't seen them play a very active role yet in the negotiation process, but that just started 2 hours and 5 minutes ago. So I'm not there. So.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. I think our time's up, but thank you to our great panelists.
Great. Well, a few closing comments. First, I hope you all have found both panels extremely stimulating. I certainly have. Maybe just to begin, I just want to thank my good friend Nancy and the terrific team here at USIP for all the support and help they've shared with us, and the Oxfam team that's put this all together. It's great working with your team, and I hope we have other opportunities. This is the beginning of a great romance between our two organizations. To our wonderful panel and moderators, some of whom travel very far, thank you very much, Fadi, for joining us. And thank you all for your thoughtful remarks and reflections on where we are today and where we need to go to make sure the humanitarian system is responding to the most vulnerable people around the world. I think that's the big project that we're all here to discuss, and hopefully we'll continue discussing into the future. I think it's probably fair to say that based on what we've heard today from those of us up on the stage, as well as from the audience and the questions that we've heard in the last few minutes, the World Humanitarian Summit was a start, certainly, but it didn't resolve the many thorny issues that bedevil the humanitarian system today. As we heard from some of the panelists, the summit often felt like a talk shop, unfortunately. And I think probably at the heart of that was the fact that it lacked enough world leaders to give the event the kind of, if you will, global standing and political will that will be required to kind of drive the necessary changes for the people who need it the most. I think Fadi's critique of the event and sort of I think the Syrian situation, the protracted conflict in that region, I think is cause for all of us to reflect upon our responsibilities to push our governments to deliver that political will and to deliver that negotiating outcome that I think we all know is essential, and I think that Anne has kind of commented on. I think it's fair to say the United States has been engaged as actively as we could imagine in the diplomatic initiative, but you can't dance alone. And this is a situation where diplomacy requires partners, and in the absence of a partner, you don't get a solution. And I think we all understand that and appreciate the work that Anne and the State Department and others are doing to try to move that agenda from here inside the United States. On the positive side, I think it's fair to say, and I think while we shared our optimism and our desire to, that there will be a hopeful future and reform in the humanitarian system, I think it's fair to say that the event brought together thousands of partners and civil society organizations and gave them a platform to be heard. And I think Anwar in the earlier session made a very powerful point about the fact that there's been many of these meetings, and his organization and his voice was not heard, and many of the other partners that were there have not often been heard. And it also allowed, I think, for vigorous debate and critique and formulation of sort of the problem definition, if you will, in ways that perhaps we haven't seen before, and I think that was a good outcome. The emergence of this near coalition of Southern partner organizations that are now giving voice to that critique from the grassroots up, and hopefully their formal inclusion in these processes going forward, I think is another positive outcome. And I think most importantly, we came out of the meeting with a framework of the 5 core responsibilities that I think in some ways are the guidance for all of us of how we should be thinking about these issues going forward, how we should be thinking about the reform process. And as we think about those core responsibilities, maybe what's really behind that and what are the things we should be thinking about? And I think first and perhaps foremost is that political leadership is not being used to prevent and end conflict. This is, I think, at the heart of this is all about political will at the end of the day. And that's what we've really got to be working on. We have to have a system that has respect for humanitarian law and that actually addresses these questions of accountability that seem to have been sort of set aside as we watch the Syrian conflict and the Yemen conflict and the South Sudanese conflicts unfold and become more and more protracted over time. The norms that safeguard humanity, such as the international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles, aren't really being upheld to protect people in crises. They really lack teeth today, and I think that's at the heart of what was missing perhaps in the summit. And those of us in the humanitarian community need perhaps to redouble our efforts to reinstate the importance and respect for international humanitarian law as well as human rights. And these norms, I think it's probably fair to say, and we would all agree, that they're critical for us to build a safer world for all citizens that ensures accountability for violations of globally accepted law and norms. We probably need to recall as we leave today that there are 60 million people displaced and living as refugees or seeking asylum that are being left behind with little protection and no hope for an education or livelihood unless something dramatic changes. The system we have in place today, and we talked a lot about the system in the first panel, is in need of radical overhaul and change of approach in financing. Maybe not a revolution, but certainly a radical incrementalist transformation process. It doesn't do enough to end need, and it often bypasses local actors and can be ineffective in delivering aid, and doesn't perhaps do enough to address the humanitarian development and even climate change divide. And I think we heard a lot about the need for that divide to be eliminated. I think we heard some hopeful comments on the fact that maybe we've made more progress in building the bridges between humanitarian work and development work for the future. But I think there's a lot to be done in the way in what we have to do in terms of changing structures, financing mechanisms, and behaviors, and perhaps most importantly, mindsets, in order for this transformation to occur. And finally, the unprecedented $24.5 billion in humanitarian aid that was delivered in 2014 was actually, as it turns out, still not enough to meet the need of this extraordinary moment that we're living at this time. And while working to end conflicts and address needs, we need to find new funding mechanisms. I think this question about, is the historic funding model adequate for the 21st century is one that needs to be much more front and center in our discussions. We had the question about, the gap in funding for the Sustainable Development Goals. This gap for humanitarian need is enormous as well. But we've got to get much more imaginative about where that money is going to come from in the 21st century, and it's not all going to come from ODA. It's got to begin to come from some of the new emergent economies, from some of the new donors, the G20 more broadly, and from taxation from those emergent economies. And we've got to capture more value, and we've got to channel more money into meeting these needs. So what's actually next in this agenda? The major outcomes of the summit have been captured, I think, and in the Secretary General's chair summary of the proceedings. We're informed that an online action platform will showcase all the commitments gathered, the 1,500 commitments that were made at the meeting, and a report of the Secretary General on the outcomes of the summit will also be produced and likely presented to all of us at the UN General Assembly in September. Again, it's important to note that some 1,500 commitments were made at various events across the summit itself. So it's actually going to take weeks, I think, from the meeting itself to for the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat to compile all this and to produce a summary that actually has some coherence and makes some sense. But I think that's an important piece of work, and I think we have to actually find some way to have mechanisms that allow us to track those commitments and see if we're actually delivering on them. And as we heard from both Ann and Beth, many of the outcomes of the summit are going to feed into President Obama's Refugee Summit and the Secretary General's high-level meeting on migration and refugee flows at the UN in September. This is an extraordinarily important meeting, and I think maybe a nice way to think about this year is this is the year of humanitarianism. The summit was the start. The UN General Assembly and the Obama-sponsored summit are a continuation of that. And we need to use every one of those opportunities to kind of continue this conversation about reform and change, inclusion, address politics and governance issues in very direct ways. And I think we should be grateful that President Obama is actually taking a leadership role among heads of state to actually make that happen as he's leaving office. So this is a nice legacy to hand off to the next president as an area of responsibility to move this agenda forward. I will say I do worry a little bit about not having a track perhaps to discuss a whole variety of issues that also have emerged in the summit and also to some degree in this conversation. Some of these complex questions about refugee status that I think that Beth was talking about. And there's a variety of other ones as well, and perhaps there'll be an opportunity to talk about whether we can create spaces for those conversations as well. So in summary, I would just repeat, the summit should not be viewed as the beginning of a process, should be viewed as the beginning of a process and not the end of that process. I think the true test of the value of an event like this and the ones that will follow will be whether or not we see real impact for the 125 million people affected by crises around the world. So all of us, I think, have a lot of work to do, and it's great knowing that all of you are a constituency for this work, and hope that you will carry forward some thoughts from today that motivate you and inspire you to continue this important work. So let me close by just thanking you all for joining us this morning. I hope you will continue to work alongside humanitarians around the world in building a more peaceful, just, and safer world for us and our children. Thank you all very, very much.